I thought that I wanted a particular type of career, and I worked very, very hard, sort of out of university into corporate world, working my way up, so to speak, that corporate ladder. And I had the glass-fronted office, I had the team, I had the influence. And one day, instead of walking into the boardroom, I found myself lying on the floor and staring up, looking up at the ceiling tiles because I'd collapsed.
Welcome to Play It By Your Rules, the podcast for those tired of living by somebody else's script and ready to live and lead on their terms. I'm your host, Maggie Rombach, coach, speaker, and strategist. I'm here to spark a little rebel energy and leave you with a sense of possibility. Each episode, I'll talk to leaders, adventurers, experts, and changemakers who found their way. Some loud and bold, others quiet and intentional. You'll walk away with fresh insights, inspiration, and practical tools to chart your next chapter. If you're craving more freedom, flow, and fun, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to Play It By Your Rules, my call for mindful rebellion to embrace your own rules, challenge the status quo, and play it by your own script. So, as always, I have an amazing guest with us today, Rachael, and I'll give you the word right away to introduce yourself. What brought you here? What's your story?
Oh, Maggie, thank you so much for having me on the show. I adore what you do here. And I've loved our conversations in getting prepared for today. I am a founder of my organization called Elevar, where we help leaders to lead themselves and others better, particularly in times of challenge and change. And my journey to get here has, been one that's seen me in senior corporate roles, enjoying and loving coaching for more than 20 years now, and working with leaders who care deeply about the impact that they have on their people, their organizations, and the world around them. And I would describe my work as my soul's contract. And it's really about helping those leaders to find the clarity, the energy, and the courage to lead well, especially when the world feels so uncertain.
I love this. And I think that's also why we connected immediately. Because
Mm.
you talk about energy, clarity, and courage. I talk more about clarity, courage, and confidence, but kind of in the same space.
Yeah.
So my first question might be unexpected because something I'm currently grappling with myself, so you'd be able to help me. So when you talk about leaders,
Mm.
what are leaders? Who are leaders?
Mm. What a beautiful question. And we can be leaders in so many ways. That's not a title. I think that's about, first of all, how do we show up and lead ourselves well? And from that point of view, and I think this might fit in really well with your mindful rebellion theme. I think leaders are people who are prepared not to be held back by some of the internal rules that maybe we have. They recognize them, they're aware of them, and so they're leading themselves well. But leaders show up in all walks of life, in all spaces. That doesn't necessarily have to be in organizations or in political places. And we have, leaders within our families, within our communities, and yeah, right across the board.
I
I
really
think,
like this. And, because I would agree with you. For me, a leader is anybody who has a following. So it's not the stripes on your shoulders. It could be really anybody. But the reason why I ask it, so I was talking a little bit, exploring how I position myself and how I define my target audience. And I found that, and maybe that's something specific to the humanitarian and development field. You know,
Mm.
there's a certain fatigue with leadership. So
Mm.
leadership are kind of the big guys who take all the tough decisions and who restructure every 2 years, and people are tired with that, so they don't necessarily see themselves as leaders because they don't want to be part of that gang. And I thought that was really interesting because for me leadership is something really positive. I look at myself as a leader, but not because I have many stripes, but because I'm perhaps now becoming more of a thought leader. So
Mm.
that's why I started talking about high performers,
Mm.
because, but that's why I asked the question. So I just thought that was interesting that not everybody automatically embraces or self-defines as a leader.
Yes, yes, and I think there's different types of leadership, and there's different types of, you said it far more eloquently than I did around, you have a following, and I really believe that the type of enduring leadership that does do good in the world is it comes from a place of service for others and for leaving, the world, the place, the organization, others in a better place. And, we are seeing very prevalent with the news this week as well, different types of leadership, much more authoritarian, coercive, um, positions of power. That's not, I think, Maggie, where you and I come from. I think we very much come from this place of, well, actually, how do we lead, keeping our heads high, our hearts open from a place of presence, of kindness, of compassion, and for doing good in the world.
Absolutely. So yeah, maybe actually talk a bit more how you got to that, because you're working with leaders to help them be more like conscious, like better leaders. So what got you to that point to say that's something we need? And is that based on your own story? So what was your journey to come to the point to work with leaders on this?
Mm. Yeah, so I I thought that I wanted a particular type of career, and I worked very, very hard, sort of out of university into corporate world, working my way up, so to speak, that corporate ladder. And I had the glass-fronted office, I had the team, I had the influence. And one day, instead of walking into the boardroom, I found myself lying on the floor and staring up, looking up at the ceiling tiles because I'd collapsed. And in that moment, I couldn't think, I couldn't breathe. And it was an incredibly scary moment. I later realized that I had had a panic attack. And what had led me there had been years, yeah, years and years of disrespecting my body and neglecting the most important relationship in my life, and genuinely feeling pretty guilty about how I was looking after myself and those, not my team, but the people who I loved and cared about the most. Uh, and believing that the answer was just to keep working harder and harder and harder. And this was after probably a decade of understanding an awful lot about positive psychology. So I was constantly reframing my stress and believing that I could just, I could handle my emotions. I knew what I was, and I could just keep on pushing through and pushing through. That was one significant turning point for me, because when I did eventually get up off the floor, I did make, a decision that it could no longer continue like that. Something had to change. It was my wake up call. And that wasn't a straight line. Of course, these things very often, they are often not a straight line. I spent the next sort of 3 years really questioning and reconnecting with my heart and what lit me up and what I felt my purpose was to do in this world. And that led me into the leadership development and the organization that I've now ran for the last 10 years or so. But that really was the wake up call moment for me. And it continues to evolve as I see the challenges that we have in the world, the the stresses that leaders carry. And so that has continued to and it will be ever evolving. I'm certain of that. But if we think about the rapid pace of change, whether it's technological, geopolitical, environmental, there is such a lot going on in the world that leaders are expected to perform, bring the results, have that clarity, be able to inspire and motivate and lead people well. And yet, very often, what I see and experience is, you know, leaders quietly on the inside, they're questioning that, they're pushing themselves harder and harder, and ultimately, it's not sustainable. And so, being able to support leaders who do genuinely care about the work that they do and to do that good in the world. It feels like such a heart-led mission and space for me to work in.
Wow, thanks for sharing. So I can imagine how that must have been a real shock in the moment. Sometimes we need the joke. And it really resonated because, I mean, I had two burnouts that I talk about quite openly, 15 years apart. But the first one was, I think, quite a similar situation to what you described because I had a really good work-life balance at the time. What
Mm.
I hadn't realized is that it was an extremely high level, so I would party hard, work hard, and do lots of sports, so there was a balance, but it was just totally unsustainable because I never properly stopped and paused. And maybe that's also something we have to learn as we grow older. At some point, we hit the wall with our heads and we are told, you know, build pause into the plan from the beginning. And what I always point to, which I find fascinating, because I'm a runner. I run a few half marathons and one and only full marathon in my life. When you train for running,
Yeah.
you build in the pause. You would not run every day for hours and hours without ever pausing because your body has to recover. So that's just part of the plan. At work, we somehow believe we don't need to do that. It's just fascinating, isn't it?
It's been one of my biggest life lessons that rest is not the reward for hard work, but that actually it's a prerequisite to be able to perform well and show up at your best.
Yes, absolutely. So tell me more. So what do you do now? So you work for 10 years, you've been working with the leaders. And do
Mm.
they, I mean, so I think you and I, we agree that what we do is useful, but how do you find, I mean, so how do the leaders you want to work with, at what point do they come to you? Because, I think whatever we're up to doing, there's a lot of need in the world for it. But you probably cannot come up to a leader and say like, hey, I think you need to pause, so
No.
do they come to you at a moment when they already hit sort of a point where they're like, this cannot go on? Or so what's your entry point and where do you take them from there?
There's a number of entry points. So the first one would be perhaps, as you might expect, leaders that are struggling, that are feeling like they are losing themselves along the way, and they know that where they're headed isn't sustainable. So that's absolutely an entry point. But also, I absolutely love and get to work with people who are already performing really, really well, and they're just ready to take that to the next level. So, very successful people, but they recognize there's something more that they want to get or that they want to give. and they're not quite sure what that is and how to access it. And so I get that entry point. And then of course I will work with some senior leadership teams as well, and that can very much be typically around senior leader teams that are navigating a lot of challenge and change, and how they improve the dynamics in terms of them working together. How are they building that trust, that sense of belonging, and how are they better understanding and leaning into the conversations around how they lead themselves and others well by how they make one another feel, which I come at this from a very, very practical, science-based perspective, which enables teams to have very constructive conversations and really remove a lot of some of the stuff that can get in the way for teams to really perform well. So that would be probably the three main entry points to the work that I do.
That sounds really cool, because I think that sounds amazing to work with people that are, basically they're already doing great and they just need this extra, like, guidance or little nudge. So can you say a bit more about the science-based communication connecting with their feeling? Yeah, I don't know. It sounds like I want to
Yes.
learn more about this. How does
Yes.
that work?
Yes, of course. So I've been absolutely fascinated by this, and of course it's come about from my own journey with this, and back to the story of me, being on the floor of my office and looking up at the ceiling tiles. You can't mindset your way out of biology forever. At some point, the body keeps the score and asks you to listen. And I was introduced to an organization called CHX Performance, and their co-founder is Professor Chris Beatty. He is the professor of evolutionary anthropology, cognition, and neuroscience at both Oxford and Kent universities here in the UK. And he's studied for the last 20 plus years this relationship between our moods and emotions and sustainable high performance. And I am now an accredited coach with them and work with CHX and Chris BD. And the science and the simplicity that he brings to being able to understand that our feelings are actually very useful signals. And instead of trying to push them to one side or ignore them, as leaders being very aware of those signals and then what to do about them, how to interpret them, and what to do, has just been completely transformational for me personally, but also for my clients and also across teams when they start to understand that this is feelings can be much more tangible and easy to understand than we perhaps might first imagine they are. It's it's incredible. It's incredible what that then means for individual performance, but also for cultures in organizations as well.
That sounds amazing. What comes up? So I'm actually also quite into non-violent communication, and I see certain parallels to what you're explaining. Because
Mm.
in non-violent communication, you would observe, then you would state the feeling, then you would look at the need behind the feeling, and
Yes.
then come with a request what to do. So even just getting to that habit, and there's no good or bad feeling, there's just a feeling. There are actually feelings where your needs are fulfilled or when they're not fulfilled. So
Yeah.
if you're angry, probably some of your needs is not fulfilled. So then you get curious, what could be that need? So it sounds like there are a lot of parallels to this approach that helps, bringing feelings and emotions to the workplace, which I think is really important, because I think maybe that's also a bit outdated now, but it's kind of like, especially for women, we feel like we shouldn't be too emotional at work. But on the contrary, if everybody can professionally and in an educated manner recognize, address, and manage emotions, everybody would be better off, right?
Absolutely. And a couple of the distinctions that I've learned through the work that I do with the CHX team and with Chris is, as you say, observing and recognizing. And then of your feelings, how much of that feeling is mood related and how much of it is emotion related? And I'll quickly describe, very simply describe the difference between the two. So if we think of mood as an internal feedback loop, so it's kind of telling us from a point of view of sleep, nutrition, hydration, temperature, anything that's it's a very oversimplistic way to put this, but anything that we can control within our own bodies, but also viruses and things like that would also come into this, which may not have, control over. But what I'm talking about is the stuff that's going on inside our skin and our bodies. So daylight, nature, movement, sleep, nutrition, as I said, how much of, let's take that anger feeling that you were talking about, how much of that is related to the fact that maybe I've not eaten today, for example, or I've not slept, and how much of it is related to something external, which we would describe as the emotion. So that's the external feedback loop, because we don't operate in these vacuums and we're not just us within our skin. We operate in a world where people and things will trigger us and impact us. How much of it is mood related? How much of it is emotion related? Because then what we do about those things is very, very different. Of course, if I'm angry because I need to eat, I can switch that signal off by giving myself, something to eat, something to drink. I may not be able to sleep straight away if it's sleep deprivation. I get this a lot with women I work with who've got young families, or they're caring, and they're not sleeping so well. It can be challenging, but actually, what can I do to help restore my energy and my bandwidth, my capacity to deal with the stresses of every day? And how do I integrate that into my regular working life in a way that feels realistic for me? And I mean, just very simply to illustrate that point with an example, we were working with a senior executive team, and one of the things that they recognized through becoming more aware of this was they were an incredibly sedentary team. They did not go out and get daylight very often, they did not go out and move very often. And so one of the things that they did as a team was that, they set themselves a challenge to walk, metaphorically, but from one office in the UK to another office in America, they set themselves the goal of those steps. And as a team, they achieved that goal of walking, and that sort of gave them that focus to collectively make sure that they were getting out and walking much more often. And they would do that by, instead of jumping on a Zoom call, getting on a telephone call and having meetings where they were able to be outside, talking and walking at the same time. Now, that's not suitable for every scenario, but they absolutely started to integrate into their working day and their working practices more of that movement, more of that daylight, and that really, really helped them. Because sometimes I think sometimes we feel like it's the thing or the person that's triggering us, but maybe if we were really honest, we haven't looked after ourselves well enough to have that capacity to deal with the situation, perhaps in the way that we would like to. And I know I've gone off on one there.
I
There's a couple of other things I'd love to share, but let me pause for
because
breath for a moment.
there's so many things that come up because this is so amazing. So maybe the first thing that came up is,
Mm,
when you have small kids, you're so much more attuned to that, because like, okay, you're grumpy, you have a tantrum. Are you tired, hungry, or sleep deprived?
yeah.
But we're big kids, so somehow we we spot it in kids, but we don't necessarily spot it in ourselves. So what
Mm.
I also hear you saying is there's a lot of it with really about self-awareness, just recognizing this. And I just really love this solution, because I think it was during COVID, At one point I got myself one of these walking machines, like not the proper running machine, but just a walking one. So I could have meetings and walk during the meeting. And I did that maybe twice. And I was like, just doesn't work for me. I want to be outside in the sun. So you're right, like this, switch the camera off and just old school, just talk to people. I think that's actually a wonderful solution to get people out more. And also what I also love about your example is that they approached it as a common, like a joint challenge. They made it something to work out together. That's really amazing.
Absolutely. And it's all about helping. I think we talk about leadership capability, and there's so much in terms of leadership development for the skills of leadership. But what I notice more and more, and yes, there's still a requirement for us to upskill our leaders from a capability. But what I notice more and more and more, it's not always about the capability, it's about the capacity. Have those leaders got the capacity? Is there energy? Is there mood? Is there bandwidth to deal with the challenges, the stresses, the strains? What's that like? What capacity, what headroom have they got to be able to deal with that? And for me, this is like a foundational part of leadership and as leading ourselves well. But we don't get taught this stuff in school. And often we don't get taught this stuff when we come into leadership roles. So how we are integrating true restoration so that we can expand our energy, our mood, and our bandwidth to deal with stress, we will then be able to cope with those external things that emotionally trigger us, whether that's something or someone or a combination of those things. And when that happens, and when you said it, observing, when we're observing what's going on there, then we can seek to properly resolve those things. But sadly, what happens with a lot of leaders is that they end up regulating how they feel for a really long time in some cases. And you said this, I think you're saying, whether people's needs are fulfilled or not. And so many times I think our needs aren't being met and we just get on with it. We suppress it or we tell ourselves it's going to be okay. And regulation like that of our feelings over a prolonged period of time, we know from the work that Chris has done that it's clinically predictive of certain risks and outcomes. We're likely to have leaders that are more disengaged, that they're doing only, average work, that it's likely to lead to burnout or departure, mental health, physical health problems. It's clinically predictive, and it also leads to things like less empathy and dysfunctional teams. So getting this stuff right is absolutely foundational. It's foundational for us as individuals, but it's foundational as well for the performance of the organization too.
Absolutely. And that's where, for me, the mindful rebellion comes in, because what I mean by that is really a lot about boundaries, but it's also about, many of us has grown up with this over sense of over delivering and over caring and people pleasing and all of that. So we also feel guilty. This example from the plane, you have to put your oxygen mask first.
Yeah.
This kind of, we feel guilty if we set our boundaries. But actually, if we do that better, set healthy boundaries. There's a really good book. If you haven't read it yet, it was kind of the last piece in the puzzle I needed. It's by Francesca Gino. It's called Rebel Talent. And what she worked on, she researched, she's based out of Yale. She researched with many teams. And what she found, what she calls rebel talent, and that is for the leaders, but also for their teams. If people are allowed to be more rebellious, in the sense that they're allowed to speak up more, to set clearer boundaries, what that leads to is to exactly the remedy of what you just described, like better employee engagement, more innovation, more retention, because people are more looking after themselves, and they're more ready to share themselves. Of course, you have to create the right environment, so you have to have a safe environment, all of that. But I just thought it was really, for me, it was like, oh my God, this is gold because it gives me some evidence to something I felt intuitively, but I couldn't really prove.
Oh, I know. And I know people roll their eyes and when people say this, and it's often overused in leadership circles, but when people feel empowered and enfranchised to challenge, to have that flexibility to do what they know will serve themselves and therefore then their organizations in the best way, you absolutely get better engagement, more initiation of and creativity of new ideas, and people stepping up to lead and to make the difference. And that's what's going to create that true competitive advantage.
And then, of course, there's the downside that if you're the leader and suddenly you have your team speak up and bring ideas, then you also have to be ready to channel that and to navigate that. Because the worst thing, of course, you can do is to encourage people to speak up and then you don't listen. So, you really have to work it on both sides, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the things that Chris would talk about in terms of our social needs as human beings, he talks about five fundamental social needs: needs for inclusion, need for certainty, need for equity or fairness, autonomy, and sort of feeling valued, or that sense of attachment or like we belong. So, when as leaders we can make sure we're meeting those five social needs of our teams, then actually things will feel good. So to your point, exactly, if I bring an idea and it doesn't fit, or my idea is not included, or it's not invited, or I don't feel that it's truly valued, that's going to trigger me emotionally. It would do any of us. So being really aware of those five social needs that we all have as human beings, and ensuring that we create team environments where we support our teams to feel like those needs are met is again, another really practical thing that we can do as leaders. And it just sort of takes it out of uh, oh, feelings are unpredictable. Well, actually, they're quite predictable, more predictable than we perhaps first realize.
I really like that. I'll definitely put those five needs into the show notes because it's it's again awareness, right? Just being aware they exist and paying attention when you see a reaction. Is that person reacting because he or she is upset, or there's just this social needs that got triggered, and then you can act on that. So I really like that. So I'm putting myself into the shoes of listeners. And this is already very like inspiring conceptually. But when we prepared, you also talked about a 4R model you're using.
Mm.
Can you just also to give something really practical to listeners, what is this model and how could listeners start using it? Or I don't know if they need you to use it or if that's something they can just walk away and try something out themselves.
Yeah, no. Well, we've talked about it conceptually, so let me just bring it right to the fore now. And we've talked about it. It is the 4R model that Chris Beatty has developed, and essentially the 4 R's. The first one is to recognize. So to recognize that your feelings are useful signals, and to tune into yourself and ask how much of that is mood related, how much of it is emotion related. If it's mood related, then we want to seek to restore. That's the second R. So we want to restore mood and integrate that into our daily, weekly, monthly, annual habits, routines, and rituals. So, how are we really looking after that internal biology and supporting ourselves well? So that's the restoration, second R. If it's emotions, that external feedback loop, something or someone's triggered me, those five needs that we were talking about, well, we need to resolve those. How do you resolve them? Well, that's might well be about how do you fix it if it's something that's triggering you, and how do you resolve it if it's someone, perhaps that's a conversation that needs to be had. And I recognize that sometimes things aren't quick to be able to resolve, and you may need to spend time talking and planning and preparing conversations that may take some time to do that. So that's the third R. That's resolve those emotional triggers. Now sometimes we can't restore or resolve, and in those cases we regulate. And that's the fourth R, regulate, and it's about regulating in a really conscious way, and also being aware that if we regulate over a prolonged period of time, it is clinically predictive of those risks and outcomes that we talked about earlier. So, how do we do this in a very positive way? And how do we seek to get back to restoration and resolution as quickly as possible? So, we can be in that. Chris would describe it as homeostasis, but we're operating then within the parameters within which our bodies function and operate well, so that we're increasing that capacity to be able to deal with the stresses, the strains, and the challenges. So that's the 4R
That's the
model.
four. Recognize, restore, resolve, regulate. So what does one do when you regulate? Is that
Great.
basically you just, I don't know. Yeah, what do you do?
So we all do this, and we will all regulate in various different ways. And there are some more helpful modes of regulation, and some more unhelpful ones. One way of regulating, a very simple one, I'm sure many listeners would be familiar with. I'm tired, so I'm going to have a coffee. You're not switching off. You're not switching off that, you're not able to restore and get the sleep, but actually the coffee is regulating how you're feeling and is enabling you to, crack on. But just get back to that true restoration as soon as you can. And of course, some people will even they will even regulate. And again, this is a pattern I see, that they will need the coffee to get going in the morning, and they'll need the glass of wine or the beer to get wind
Yeah.
down at night. It's not huge substance abuse, but it is recognizing that is and can be a very unconscious or unhelpful way of regulating. A far more positive way of regulating would be the positive mindset. So I know I talked about this earlier, and whilst the mindset must never come at a prolonged expense of our biology, this psychology can be exceptionally helpful. And successful leaders, and you, Meggie, will have done this as well. We all reframe and help ourselves see things differently. So, how we are using our bodies physically, where we are choosing to direct our focus, and what we are deciding any situation means, recognizing that we have the ability to decide that between any stimulus and our response, we can put a space between those two things. And in that space is our freedom to be able to choose how we respond. So somebody somebody says or does something that makes me become incredibly tense. I know that in that space before I respond, I can choose just to take a deep breath and relax my body. I can choose to focus on what they said and how angry I am, or frustrated or upset I am, or I could choose to focus on what does this allow me the opportunity to do? How can I make this better? Where might we not be fully understanding one another? I get the opportunity to shift my focus from what's wrong to the opportunity to make this right, from what I'm afraid of to where I want to go. That focus is a choice. And then ultimately, what that means and what I say to myself about that. So that powerful reframing is a very useful strategy for regulation.
Thanks. That's, really insightful. And what that reminded me of, I read a really good book by a Indian, don't want to say guru, but probably almost a guru. She's called Sister Shivani, and she defines responsibility as the ability to respond. So really response ability. And I think it's really what you just described. We all have
Mm,
this responsibility to take that pause and decide how we respond. It's just, again, we're not taught to do that at school. But if you get there, it's really powerful. The other thing that came up when you talked about the coffee and about the body, and yet you have to listen to your body and actually know your body.
mm,
Because when I got into that, because I would do the same coffee in the morning, coffee after lunch. But then I learned that actually, when you drink coffee, what you do, the transmitters of the coffee block your body. So basically, you feel more awake, but you're actually not, because you didn't restore, because the coffee blocks those transmitters. So what I'm doing now, I would first either have a short nap or even just 5 minutes of
yeah,
mindfulness, meditation, whatever. And if I still need it, then I have the coffee. But what it does is that you restore before you block those transmitters. So actually your body has a chance to recover, right? But all these things, I mean, we have to find them ourselves. It's not like common knowledge you just find easily. You stumble across it at one point and you go like, oh yeah, that makes sense, right?
yeah. And in some ways, it's really simple because it's all the stuff your grandma would tell you to do. And at the same time, life is so busy and can be very demanding for us that it's really easy to put ourselves last and to get caught up in the day to day so that we're not doing that. And I love your examples, by the way, that short nap, that mindfulness. For me, I might just take a 5 minute walk down to the end of the road and back. But those are really that they are little tiny bits of restoration that we can build into our day. And as leaders, how do we role model that for our teams? So that they feel that they've got permission to do that and not to be chained to their desks, so to speak.
Absolutely. So I think, and that for the leaders listening to that, I think it starts with really role modeling it and giving permission to do that, to not penalize people that suddenly go for a little walk at just after lunch. So whatever, go for it. So I'm just conscious of time. So let's move to the quickfire burst question, and then you'll have a moment to, if there's anything that you're burning to still bring to our listeners, you can do that after the quickfire. So you know the game. I'll be firing 7 questions at you, and I challenge you to answer with one question and one idea, one word, as concise as possible. Ready to go?
Ready?
Here we go.
Okay.
So, one belief you had to drop to live your way.
That working harder isn't always the answer.
Absolutely. A place that cracked something open in you.
Well, it has to be that moment on the floor of my office when I collapsed, when I had that panic attack.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah. One thing you had to unlearn.
Well, I would come back to what we were talking about before and say that rest isn't the reward for hard work. It's actually a critical input to being able to show up and perform at your best.
I love that. To rest really being the prerequisite for hard work, like that. What is your non-negotiable right now?
This is an ongoing journey for me. So it's about protecting that energy so that I can show up and lead with presence, and especially at the moment because we have a lot going on really positively, but from a family point of view. And so yeah, protecting that energy so I can show up as the wife, as the mum, as the daughter, and as the leader that I most want to be.
That's nice. So protect energy, and it's so important to do that, right? So what is the boldest risk that you took and that paid off?
Leaving the corporate world and that corporate career to follow what I felt called to do.
I
I
love
would
it.
never have it any other way now.
And you're on that journey for 10 years, and that's a true inspiration for me because I left only last year. So, you're a role model to me to see that you're thriving on it 10 years in. That's the vision.
I love it. I love it.
So, one word for your leadership or life in this chapter.
Evolving.
And the ripple you hope your story creates.
Mm. Uh, I think as leaders, we can have more influence than sometimes we think, and that even the small choices that we that we make. I mean, what you'd said about the book that you'd read most recently, that responsibility is the ability to respond. I really love that. And I think even the small choices, it's moment to moment to moment, we get the opportunity to decide who we most want to be and the leaders that we most want to show up as. And so, moment to moment, just choose wisely and with that responsibility.
I like that. It's almost all those small ripples. If we all do them, all of us, often enough, in a conscious and mindful, all of this way, at one point it'll become a tsunami. But you'll have to keep on going little by little, right?
Yes, yes.
I like that. Well, thanks so much for playing along. I know it's hard to bottom line, but I love this exercise. So, as we wrap this up, is there anything else that's like burning that you would like to share with listeners that are now really intrigued about your work, about what we shared? Anything else you would like to leave them with?
I think just to bring this full circle back to what we said right at the beginning, anyone can be a leader. Lead yourself well. Remember, it's not about being perfect, but it is about showing up with presence and with your heart.
Oh, I love that. That's perfect ending. So, thank you so much. And yes, have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
That's it for today. If this stirred something in you, don't just sit on it. Do something, anything, today, right now. Take one small intentional step toward more freedom, flow, and fun. And see where the ride takes you. If this hit home, follow the show, share it with a friend, or leave a review. That's how we ripple this energy further. Want to go deeper? Head over to mindset/mastery.ch for coaching, tools, and next steps. Until next time, trust your gut, stay curious, and keep playing it by your rules. Bye for now.